The bell was never meant to ring after dusk. And yet, last night, it did. You're back then. I always start these the same way. Softly, as if the story might hear me, and open itself just enough. You listen how she used to listen, with quiet hands and eyes that don't blink too often. That's good, because this one should never be rushed. The bell was cold when they found it, still warm at the base, but cold at the rim. They said it hadn't rung in 41 winters, not since the widow in black vanished during the frost-fast vigil, not since her door blew open and stayed that way. The strange part, it wasn't hanging in the chapel tower anymore. It was tucked behind her hearth, soot-covered, cradled in dry wood ash like a sleeping child. That's not how bells retire. That's how they're hidden. They call it the still bell vow. An old rite whispered in the valley where trees outnumber graves. Once the bell rings for the last time, it must never ring again. Not even in memory. And yet, there it was. Silent, but no longer untouched. I'm not the first to tell this. I only finish it. I rewrite the entries that were filed too soon, the ones where ink runs dry halfway down the page. Not for pleasure, for correction, and maybe to warn someone else. It started with a letter. The ink was brown but still fluid, dated 1913. But the paper didn't yellow, and the creases unfolded themselves like they'd been waiting. If you've ever opened something and felt it open you back, you'll understand why she never spoke of the bell again. That was all it said. Signed in a name that hadn't appeared in the census since the fire line shift. A name scratched into the old chapel wall just beneath the rope pulley. M. Fenwick, widow keeper. She wasn't clergy. She wasn't even from the village. But she stayed long enough to carry the bell down the tower herself. That's what the caretaker said, though his voice always cracked. Right before he'd say the rest. The house still stands, if you can call it that. The shutters are nailed, but one always swings open on fog-heavy nights. The smell of wood ash and rust lingers, even though no fires burned there in years. She'd left everything untouched, except the room with the bell. The first time the bell appeared, it was bound, wrapped in a black mourning veil, stiff with age. The kind stitched by the widows who kept to themselves, who only looked up when you said a name that was no longer spoken. It's not the veil that chills me. It's the thread, braided with hair, some gray, some auburn. Not hers. Or maybe it was. That's the thing with memories tied to objects. They don't ask permission before rearranging the past. It's not just the bell. It's how she held it, like it might speak again, if she loosened her grip. She had one rule: never let it ring after dusk. She told no one why, but when you stood in that house, even now, you can feel the absence of sound stretch a little too far. It's not silence, it's something beneath it, like a breath, waiting to finish. The bell sat on the mantel the night she vanished. They say the room smelled like burnt wool and wild thyme. That's what they used to anoint the dying in the southern passes, to keep the echo from following. But no one found a body, only the impression of her knees in the dust by the hearth. And the bell turned slightly, as if someone had nudged it before they left. Notice what she doesn't say here. No goodbyes. No letter this time, only the way the windows were locked from the inside. The morning fog hung low across the Fireline Hills. You could hear nothing but your own boots in the frost. No birds, no bells, only that wide, dry quiet that presses against your throat when something's gone missing, but hasn't been declared lost. Then a child heard it. Faintly, a single chime. Not from the chapel, from the widow's house. But when they forced the door, nothing moved, not even the air, and in the soot below the mantel was a second set of knees, smaller, facing the bell. If you've ever waited beside a closed door, knowing something is listening on the other side, you'll understand why no one touches the bell now. It hasn't rung again, but it hasn't cooled either. And if you ask me why I'm still writing this, still walking the long trail to where her story disappeared, it's because the bell is still warm at the base, and I need to know why. If you've ever heard something but couldn't find where it came from, this part might feel familiar. The second time the bell appeared was 3 days after the widow vanished. It wasn't in the chapel, it wasn't in her home. It was halfway down the Fireline Trail, nestled in frost-bitten moss beside a torn length of black veil and an empty boot. No footprints, no drag marks, just stillness, as though the bell had fallen out of time and landed softly in the dirt. They say she used to walk that path each morning before the sun reached the tree roots, back when the fog still moved like a living thing, folding in on itself, pausing at the sound of a name. She carried nothing but a lantern and the bell, but the villagers never heard it chime. That was the vow. Silence after loss, or follow what answers. It's carved in the chapel's east lintel, half swallowed by vines, scratched over with more recent initials. Children say it's just a warning about storms. But older ones, they speak lower when they pass it. The bell in the moss had no soot this time, no ash, no veil, no sign of hands. But it was warm again, only faintly, like it had been rung, then left, to cool alone. She doesn't answer right away. That silence, it changes everything. If you've ever tried to follow silence, you know how it deceives. It pulls you left when you meant to turn right. It leads you towards soundless openings, where the trees bend back, but don't remember doing so. The search party didn't call her name. They only whispered the lantern's color and prayed not to find her shadow. What they found was worse. The bell was turned sideways, pointing not up, but forward, toward a path. No longer marked on the maps, and lying beneath it, barely visible, was a curl of paper pressed to the frost. No ink, just a faint outline of something circular, a ring, and inside it, a single word, again. One of the searchers, Joseph Linney, the barkeep's brother, reached to pick it up. He told the others the bell felt familiar. Too familiar. He said the metal hummed, but not with sound, with memory. Said he'd dreamt of it before, not ringing, but calling. He didn't sleep again after that, They buried him 7 days later. No cause found, but his hands were blistered black, as if he'd gripped something too tightly. The bell disappeared again that night. Not stolen, not taken, just absent, and in its place was Joseph's boot, turned sideways in the moss, like the bell had borrowed its shape and left it behind. The villagers didn't search after that. They stopped walking the fire line, and the chapel bell, the one still strung above the pulpit, began to tilt, just slightly, as if echoing something it wasn't allowed to say. They wrapped the tower rope in salt-stained linen, 3 loops bound with prayer knots, a ritual known only to the elder mourners, to keep the summons from returning. That's how the folklore goes. Salt for silence, knot for memory, linen for what can't be unspoken. But the rope still shifted when the wind stopped, and sometimes you could hear it creak without motion. Some said the house was buried in salt. Others claimed it never stood at all. The bell isn't meant to move on its own. But the villagers stopped speaking of what it meant to move. Anything. They began locking windows before dusk. They used to keep them open for the dead, to let them pass untroubled. Now they bricked the lower frames. Even the widows, especially the widows. If you've ever had the feeling that something was remembering you, even as you tried to forget it, then you already understand why the bell returned a 3rd time. Because grief doesn't ring once. It resonates. Even when the sound is gone, it finds a way to echo through you. That 3rd return we'll speak of soon, but not yet. There's a rhythm to this, and it's never safe to skip a beat. Not in places like these. Would you have touched it? Would you have followed what pointed forward, even if the path no longer existed? I've read the ledgers, all the redacted names. The ones who said yes are the ones we can't ask now. Would you have opened it? The 3rd return wasn't quiet. Not at first. It came with wind that didn't belong to the season. Too cold for spring, too fast for the mountains. It blew the chapel door inward, split the veil nailed above the nave, and rang the bell. Just once. But no one had touched the rope. No one had even entered the tower since the salt knots turned black. If you've ever felt the shape of a sound, before hearing it, you'll know what it meant. For that chime to arrive without an echo. It rang, but it didn't return. The wind swallowed it, and then nothing. They found the bell again, inside the widow's former bedroom, the one she kept locked from the inside, the one with no key. It was upright, centered perfectly on the bed. Ashes beneath it, but the mattress hadn't burned. Only the space where someone had knelt, and the rope hung from the ceiling beam, like a forgotten limb. Cut clean. She lights the candle, but never looks at it. That's what changed, I think. There was something else that hadn't been there before. A folded page, stained along the fold. Not water, not wax. Pressed into it was the shape of a hand, thin, angular, like it had rested there for too long. And the writing, it wasn't ink. It looked carved into the paper, pressed from the back. Raised, not written, it read, "The still bell is not a warning, it is a request." Years before the widow ever came, the bell had been used to mark fire lines. Watchers stationed at the edge of flame would ring once if the wind shifted, twice if the flame jumped, 3 times if they wouldn't be coming home. But the records show something strange. In 1896, there were 4 rings, recorded in the chapel ledger. No fire that year, just a gap in the reports, a lost name, and then a widow who appeared without origin. She took up residence without purchasing the property, signed no deed, brought no belongings, but the bell, a lantern, and a pair of boots still marked by heat. Some believed she was married to one of the missing watchmen. Others swore she wasn't a widow at all, yet lived by mourning rules. No one could explain. She never removed her veil, even in sleep, never entered the chapel, never asked for coin or kindness. But when the bell vanished that first time, no one knocked at her door, not even the elders, and when she answered it again herself. 2 years later, she was older, but her boots were clean. That bell, they say, it didn't summon fire. It stopped it, called it back into the earth, but only if the ringer had witnessed loss, without running. A still bell vow meant standing your ground, while watching it all fall, and those who rang it never told what they saw, because the sound was never meant to echo. It was meant to stay with the ringer, inside them, until they disappeared too. That's what the widow had done. She rang it once, long ago. Then she waited for the silence to settle in her bones. And when the village stopped remembering why the bell was quiet, she left the sound behind. You remember the silence, the one from the bell tower. It wasn't just absence. It was held breath, bound grief, pressed between floorboards and soot. And now the bell had rung again, but no one had earned it. Would you have opened the bedroom door once the rope went still? Would you have stepped into a room where the only sound had already happened? Not everyone wants to know what silence leaves behind, but I've been reading these ledgers long enough to understand one thing. Sometimes silence is the only sound that survives, and once it rings through you, you don't come back with the same name. The bell hasn't moved, but something else has. She hasn't spoken since she left the bedroom, since that sound. Not a chime exactly, but a tightening of the room around her breath. Now she's downstairs again. Lantern off, shoes removed, the hearth long gone cold. Her hands are grey from soot, but not from touching the ash. She's been carrying the bell, not by its handle, not like an object, more like a child. It sits in her lap now, bare brass against linen. Her thumb traces the rim, and it's warm again, but only near the base. It grows colder as her hand rises. There's a sound now, not ringing exactly, but a tight pull, like a knot behind the air. Her eyes widen, not with fear, but with recognition. In some corners of Victorian Wales, they said if a bell rang without its clapper, it meant someone had stayed behind. Not fully dead, not fully gone. To stop it, families would bury the clapper beneath the threshold stone, or hang the bell from the eaves so the wind could finish the goodbye. Eva just presses her hand over the brass and breathes through her teeth. The sound doesn't come from the bell. It comes from her. She lifts it, just a little, and sets it on the window frame, facing inward, facing the dark. The candle she never lit still rests beneath it, its wax slouched, its wick soft. No one sees her do this, but I think it matters. It's as if she's waiting for a different sound this time, a quieter one. She doesn't look for the clapper. She doesn't even seem to notice it's gone. Maybe she buried it. Maybe it was never there. Or maybe she realized some bells don't need to ring to be heard. She goes back to the drawer. The same one from days ago. The one with the rope binding. The one that didn't creak until she stopped trying to force it. This time, she opens it slowly. Hands both flat. No search. No struggle. Inside is nothing that matters. A dried flower, half a comb, a folded page where the ink has faded so much you'd have to read it with your fingertips. She picks it up anyway, smiles at it as if she just remembered something and forgave it. She closes the drawer with both hands this time. That's when I knew she was done searching. She doesn't throw anything away, doesn't pack. She just turns the bell so it faces the door and walks away. I don't know what she was listening for, but I do know this. She never left through the front, only the back, past the thicket, through the lichen-covered arch, into the part of the woods where the fire line stopped, but the trees never grew back. If you've ever walked a path you weren't sure was real, you'll understand why she didn't turn around. They say the bell never rang again after that. But it was warm when they touched it, still warm at the base, as if it had been held by someone with steady hands, and colder, with every inch toward the rim. They said it happened once before, but no one remembers who she was. They buried the chapel's records during the frost years. Not burned, not lost, buried, stacked beneath the floorboards of the east vestry, sealed inside a copper trunk, lined with black mourning lace and dried salt root. It was meant to keep things from leaking. Not ink, not memory, something else. When they opened it in 1972, most of the papers had fused together, but one remained intact. File number 029, marked in red wax with a ring imprint. Not a crest, not a seal, just a bell with a line through it, a kind of hush mark. Inside, 3 pages, 1 ledger entry, 1 map fragment, 1 letter never signed, if you've ever read a name aloud, and felt the air pause after. This might explain why. The ledger spoke of the second ringing, an event believed to signal the moment when a vow slips from memory into habit. It noted that in 1896 no fires were recorded, but a widow-shaped figure was seen walking through smoke outside the fire line perimeter, seen but not followed. The notation ends with a small hand-drawn glyph, an eye inside a bell. No words, only a circle pressed in smudged graphite, as if rubbed by ash-covered fingers. The map fragment was older, marked with 3 paths. 2 solid, 1 faded and broken by water stains. The solid trails ran through known watch routes, but the faded path, it led to a place simply labeled unsummoned. The bell symbol appeared there too, but inverted, as if the ringing had gone inward instead of out. This is the part I still think about. Not the bell, not the ledger, just how quiet it got. The letter, unsigned, was folded 4 times, each crease dusted with what looked like soot, but glimmered faintly under oil lamp light. Inside, only 1 sentence had survived the rot. If she rings again, someone must follow, but only the one who heard nothing. Some say the note refers to a second watcher. Others think it names a child, not yet born at the time. But there's a third theory, spoken only by the archivists who rebind forbidden volumes, that the still bell doesn't summon aid. It signals the moment grief becomes inheritance. Old Valley law held that mourning must be witnessed, not out loud, but by presence. At every burial, 1 silent mourner was chosen, draped in gray, unnamed, unthanked. They stood apart, never looked down, and carried a bell without a clapper, pressed to their chest. If it vibrated, they'd take the name of the dead upon themselves, until someone else noticed. A kind of grief transfer, a silent adoption of sorrow, so no echo would linger unclaimed. But the last recorded silent mourner vanished during a snow vigil. She'd been seen entering the chapel alone, but when the door reopened, only the bell remained, still warm, missing the thread that held it to her. And later that year, a widow arrived with a veil too long and boots too clean. The story folds here, becomes a loop, a knot, a turning path, not because it ends, but because someone keeps picking up the bell without knowing they've been summoned. They say grief echoes, but only for those who pretend not to hear it. For the rest, it becomes a rhythm, deep beneath the skin, a quiet percussion, tapped out in the soles of boots, the corners of letters, the flicker of old lanterns. When no one's near enough to cause the wind. Some say it wasn't her veil that made her a widow. It was the sound she carried. Would you have followed that path? The unsummoned trail, no longer found on maps, the one that begins, where the bell was last heard, by someone who didn't react, not because they weren't afraid, but because the sound was already inside them. If you've ever mistaken stillness for safety, then you understand. Because silence doesn't mean it's over. Sometimes it just means you're next in line. There's nothing else to do tonight but drift. The bell has not rung again, not out loud, but the chapel still tilts slightly in the direction of its last sound. And the rope, what's left of it, shifts on windless nights. Not enough to move, just enough to wait. The widow's veil was never found. Not truly, a single thread, yes, woven into the base of a child's coat, a fleck of soot, yes, pressed between 2 blank pages in the ledger. But the veil itself, gone, like fog after it remembers something. If you've ever watched someone disappear, not suddenly but gradually, you know this kind of silence. It doesn't echo, it softens, like old bells do when they've carried too many names. She used to walk with purpose, but tonight she drifts, and maybe so should you. Some say the bell was never made to call the dead, only to remind the living that not all memories belong in light, that some must flicker quietly, in the corners of locked rooms, behind shelves, in stories that don't ask for a listener. The girl, Eva, she no longer speaks of that night, but she keeps a lantern by her bedside, wipes the glass each morning, and once each season she opens the window and leaves a small stone on the sill. Not a ritual, just a rhythm, her own. Some say it's her way of answering the bell without letting it ring. The last entry in the chapel's second ledger reads only, "Weight transferred, echo retained, name unknown." Not signed, but the script matches the original 1896 Watcher's logs. Loops in the R's, soft slant leftward, the kind of handwriting that knows what not to say. I found it folded behind the old rope coil, pressed flat beneath 2 rusted lantern hooks, still warm, like paper kept under breath for too long. The strange part, the page beside it was blank, but smelled faintly of iron and time. I filed it where it belonged, in the drawer without a label, the one meant for stories that never truly close, and I sealed it with a slip of fabric. Not black, not gray, but the color of ash. Just before wind carries it away. Not erasure, just drifting. Would you have followed her? Through the fog, through the unsummoned path, where echoes go when they're too tired to return. Some say the bell was her burden. Others say it was her gift, a way of holding grief, so the rest of us could sleep. But gifts are not always gentle. Sometimes they ask us to keep listening, long after the sound ends. Some names aren't written, they settle, like dust, like breath. And now, there is no widow, only the bell, and the quiet it taught us to respect. The bell was cold when they found it, still warm at the base, but cold at the rim. There's nothing else to do tonight but drift. Let the silence finish its story. Let the name rest without reply. Let the watcher step away from the fire line. You're safe now. Sleep well. I'll be here when the lights go low again.